For thousands of years, human life has been in step with the slow march of the sun and the gentle change of seasons. In the morning, when the first light breaks through the mist over the fields, people wake not to the sound of factory sirens, but to the chirping of birds and the roosters heralding a new day. In the small villages scattered across the vast lands of Europe, Asia, Africa, and the rest of the world, the human hand was the most important machine ever known. The hoe and the plow were mere extensions of the arm, while the strength of a horse, the flow of a small stream, or the breeze in a simple sail were the only forces they could borrow from nature. A 17th-century farmer saw a world much the same as a farmer 1,000 years earlier. Seeds were sown with gestures passed from father to son. Harvests were determined by the generosity of rain and the wrath of winter, and crop failure meant famine, an accepted part of fate. A merchant in 1700 could walk the city streets and experience an atmosphere that would have been very familiar to a Roman merchant. Small shops, open-air markets, wooden carts creaking on cobblestones, and sailing ships waiting for the wind in the harbor, all moved to the same rhythm, the unhurried rhythm of nature. At night, when the sun sets, the world falls silent. Without electric lights or factories humming all night, darkness forces humans to stop, rest, and surrender to the limits set by heaven. Activities shrink to stories by the fire, whispered prayers, and dreams left to grow beneath the eyelids. Most people are born, live, and die within a radius of a few kilometers from where they first saw the world. Stories about distant lands come in the form of rumors, myths, or letters that arrive too late, telling of a past that no longer matches the reality in the distance. Beneath that simplicity, harsh limits also lurk. Famine strikes when crops fail, disease sweeps through villages with no cure, and feudal warfare can destroy everything a family has built over a generation. But in a small corner of the world, on a damp, foggy island off the coast of Europe, something is beginning to change. In the increasingly cultivated fields, in the small workshops where new ideas are tested, and in the dark underground where the black rot called coal is pulled from the earth, a different rhythm is beginning to be heard. At first, it was faint, like the distant clink of hammers or the hiss of newborn steam. But the sound grew, overtaking the whisper of the wind and the creak of the cart, becoming a constant roar that no longer cared whether the sun was shining or the rain was falling. It was the sound of the first gears turning tirelessly, driven not by human muscle, but by power drawn directly from stone and fire. For the first time in history, humans had found a way to free themselves from the constraints of physical and animal power, replacing them with machines that never tired, never hungry, and never asked for wages. It was at that moment, without realizing it, that a big question arose, though it had not yet been expressed. What would happen when the world, which had always followed the rhythm of nature, was suddenly forced to follow the rhythm of machines? There, women spun cotton or wool fibers into thin threads, turning wheels with the same movements as their mothers and grandmothers centuries before. In another corner, men wove the thread into cloth on a wooden loom, each tap of the foot and pull of the arm giving birth to a pattern that slowly emerges row by row. This system is called putting out. Traders bring the raw fiber to homes, distribute it to families, and then return weeks later to pick up the finished yarn or cloth. The work takes place in the midst of life, amidst the cries of babies, family conversations, and the rhythm of the day dictated by sunlight, not a clock.
In Indian workshops, artisans worked for much lower wages, and their skill made each piece of fabric a work of art. And British entrepreneurs knew that competing with them using traditional methods was nearly impossible. Indian labor was cheaper and the quality was higher. This imbalance prompted the British government to intervene sharply. Laws like Calico Acts were enacted to restrict the influx of Indian cotton and protect the domestic wool and linen industries. In 1733, a man named John Kay introduced a simple device that would change the balance of labor in the weaving house, the flying shuttle. With its ingenious sliding mechanism, it allowed one weaver to do the work of two, catapulting a bobbin of yarn across the loom at a speed unimaginable. Instantly, weaving productivity soared, but every solution created new problems. Today, weaving moves much faster than spinning. Weavers wait for yarn that never seems to be enough, frustrated that their looms are idle while spinners work late into the night to catch up. It's estimated that it takes nearly 8 spinners to supply yarn to a single weaver using a flying shuttle. In this new arena, time is the enemy, and humans begin to feel the limits of their own hands. It would be decades before anyone would attempt to address this imbalance. In the 1760s, James Hargreaves, a carpenter and spinner from Lancashire, created a machine that seemed simple but held explosive potential, the spinning jenny. With a wooden frame and a row of spindles, it allowed a single person to spin multiple threads at once, not one, but many. To some, the spinning jenny was a miracle. In a small space, a single spinner could produce far more yarn than ever before, turning fatigue into efficiency. But to others, the machine seemed like a betrayal. If one person could do the work of many, what would happen to all the other hands that had depended on their spinning wheels?
While the spinning jenny could still survive indoors, the next invention forced production out of the living room. Richard Arkwright, a businessman with keen instincts and fierce determination, worked with inventors to develop the water frame, a water-powered spinning frame. This machine was too large and heavy to be housed in a home. It required its own building and a strong river current to power the water wheel. One by one, traditional weavers on other continents are finding that their skills are no longer enough to compete. They are not losing because they lack skills, but because they are up against something they cannot touch, the roar of machines in distant lands, and a global trading system that now favors mass production. In England itself, families who once spun and wove at home now found themselves a small part of a long line of factory workers. They no longer determined when to start and stop work. Factory clocks and supervisors took over. Home became a temporary retreat, no longer a center of production. The world of work shifted to tall stone buildings, edged by narrow windows and tall chimneys.
Before the engines roared and the city's skies darkened with smoke, the Industrial Revolution was not a certainty, just a possibility slowly gathering in one small corner of the world, England. On 18th century maps, it appeared as a mere soggy island on the edge of Europe, but beneath its fog and rain, history was gathering fuel for the greatest explosion in human labor. The change began on the land. In rural England, once small, irregularly divided fields were being united through the policy of enclosure, creating vast expanses that could be cultivated in new ways. There, seeds were no longer scattered haphazardly by weary hands, but were neatly arranged by mechanical seed drills, while iron plows dug deeper into the earth than their brittle wooden predecessors. Yields increased, more people could feed their stomachs, and ironically, fewer hands were needed to keep the land productive. England enjoyed something that many of its neighbors rarely had: relative political stability. After waves of conflict and revolution had rocked continental Europe, England entered the 18th century with a legal system that, while imperfect, began to protect property rights and allow ordinary people to dream of greatness. In the courts and parliament, ideas about contracts, corporations, and investment flourished alongside ambition, giving merchants and entrepreneurs confidence that their accumulated wealth would not be swept away by the next civil war. The island is blessed with a favorable shape and location. England is an island nation with a long coastline, dotted with bays and natural harbors, as if the earth itself had carved out gateways for goods and ideas. Slowly but surely, flowing rivers cut through the interior, providing natural shipping routes long before iron rails and locomotives dominated the landscape. Something had changed in the mind. In the previous century, thinkers in England and Europe had participated in the scientific revolution. They questioned conventions, measured natural phenomena, tested ideas with repeated experiments, and dared to conclude that the world might be governed by understandable laws. In small workshops, humble laboratories, and scientific meeting rooms, a culture of trial and error began to be valued. When scientific thinking meets economic necessity, something both dangerous and productive is born. An obsession with not only understanding the world, but transforming it to make it more profitable. Craftsmen no longer simply accept traditions passed down through generations. They tinker with machines, modify gears, reconfigure valves, and write down the results of their experiments. It is at this point that knowledge begins to descend from the ivory tower to the workshop floor. But perhaps the most important fuel of all lies beneath their feet: coal. In many parts of the world, wood is a primary energy source, but forests have their limits. They grow slowly, while the demand for heat and metals is soaring rapidly. Britain, by chance or fate, sits atop a thick layer of black rock that has stored energy for millions of years, waiting to be tapped and ignited. In this country, wages are relatively high compared to many other regions, while coal can be obtained much cheaper. This combination creates an invisible but powerful incentive. If hiring people is expensive, but running machines is cheap, then it makes sense to imagine a world where machines replace human hands. Every labor hour saved becomes a profit, and every new machine capable of replacing several workers becomes a promising investment. At this point, all the pillars began to reinforce each other. Productive farms liberated labor, legal and corporate systems made room for capital, ports and rivers connected distant markets, a scientific culture fostered innovation, and coal provided the cheap power to power it all. Britain wasn't just ready to receive the machine, it almost beckoned to it. But from the perspective of the common man, none of this seems like a grand plan. To a small farmer driven from his land by changing regulations, the world seems smaller. To a dock worker watching the great ships depart and return, the sea is merely a gateway to riches that never reach his hands. Little did they know they were standing on the brink of a historical precipice, where the way humans worked, moved, and dreamed would be transformed by something that didn't yet have a name. Later, people would call it the Industrial Revolution, but at the time, it was just a series of small decisions, simple experiments, and everyday compromises that slowly shifted the world from the rhythm of nature to the rhythm of the machine.
The underground Industrial Revolution began in coal mines, as miners dug deeper and were hampered by floodwaters in narrow passages. Thomas Newcomen designed the wasteful but effective water-pumping steam engine, allowing mines to be drained, more coal to be lifted, and steam power to become a new power source, no longer dependent on seasons or river flows.
Coal then transformed the world of iron through coke, opening up large-scale metal production, though workers faced extreme heat, high risks, and short working lives to support the bridges, buildings, and railways of the future. As steam-powered factories grew, villages quickly transformed into dense industrial cities, with rivers polluted by sewage and squalid, disease-ridden workers' quarters. Observers such as Friedrich Engels noted the contrast between the barren wasteland of the workers and the luxury of the capitalists. While the new middle class enjoyed comfortable homes, regular consumption of sugar, tea, coffee, and household goods as symbols of comfort and status.
For many craftsmen and laborers, machines meant the loss of their livelihoods, giving rise to the Luddite movement, which destroyed machines as an expression of their fear becoming useless in an industrialized world. Strikes and unionization forced legal changes, restrictions on working hours, protection of women and children, and the beginning of the idea of early childhood education, while environmental damage from fossil fuel combustion and urban pollution initiated modern questions about the long-term consequences of a fossil fuel-based civilization. We live in a world that the farmers who rose with the sun at the beginning of this story could hardly have imagined. We have the convenience, speed, and choices they lacked, but we also inherited questions they never imagined. What are the long-term consequences of building a civilization on the foundation of fossil fuels and endless production?